Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Salmon P. Chase Distinguished Lecture. My name is Christopher Green, and I am the Associate Director of External Affairs at the Salmon P. Chase Center for Civics, Culture, and Society. The Chase Lecture Series is devoted to careful consideration of the sorts of men and women whose lives offer models of civic friendship and leadership, and whose study can teach us something about how, as citizens, we can best improve the flourishing of Ohio State, of America, and of the world in general. Both Salmon P. Chase himself and Abraham Lincoln, of course, are premier exemplars of the sorts of lives that repay careful study. Last spring, we brought in the leading living expert on Chase, Walter Starr, to discuss Chase's life in detail. Today, we have the leading living expert on Lincoln, Allen Guelzo, who will discuss Chase's relationship with Lincoln. Professor Guelzo has an MDiv from Reformed Episcopal Seminary and a PhD in history from the University of Pennsylvania, and has taught at Eastern University, Gettysburg College, and Princeton University before moving this summer to the Hamilton Center at the University of Florida. Professor Guelzo's first book on the development of Jonathan Edwards' thought in the century after Edwards' death won an American Library Association Choice Award, and a second book on Reformed Episcopalians in the late 19th and early 20th centuries won the Outler Prize. Since then, he has focused chiefly on Lincoln, winning the Lincoln Prize an unprecedented 3 times, the first for Abraham Lincoln Redeemer President, which my historian friends tell me has revolutionized how scholars think about Lincoln's theology. The second Lincoln Prize was for a book on the Emancipation Proclamation, and the third on the Gettysburg Invasion. He has also written books on the Lincoln-Douglas debates, on Robert E. Lee, 2 books on Reconstruction, and an Oxford very short introduction to Lincoln, and has also kept up his work on Jonathan Edwards with 2 other books, as well as contributing half the episodes of the Great Courses course on U.S. history and writing the 2nd volume of a huge history of the Western tradition, The Golden Thread, covering 1500 to the present, or till 1991, its approximation of the present. Tonight, Professor Guelzo will talk about Lincoln and Chase, parallel visions, conflicting strategies. He'll speak for approximately 40 minutes, leaving 15 minutes for your questions. Please join me in welcoming Professor Allen Guelzo.
I don't know about you, but hearing all that just leaves me exhausted. Thanking goodness. I bring you the greetings of a sister institution, which is the Hamilton Center for Classical and Civic Education at the University of Florida. We're happy to encourage our friends here at the Chase Center. I especially am happy to have accepted the invitation from Lee Strang, your director, and from Christopher Green, and from a former student of mine who's one of the faculty now here at the Chase Center, and that is Brianna Fracas. She was a student of mine at Gettysburg College. So these are cheering connections that I'm always happy to encounter wherever I go, and particularly here. Here in a place that seeks to honor the reputation, the history, the career, and the accomplishments of Selman Portland Chase. So let me begin by taking you back to February of 1861, when it was, believe me, very cold. Despite that February cold, something like 12,000 people crowded around the train shed at Dunkirk, New York, to see their new president-elect, Abraham Lincoln, make a brief station stop on his long pre-inaugural tour across the North. "I regret I cannot stop to speak to you," Lincoln apologetically explained from a hastily built platform. Because the train had a schedule, he had to be in Buffalo by nightfall. But for the sake of these long-suffering Dunkirkers who had waited through the cold, he condensed the stock speech he had been making at all of his major stops and ended with one urgent exhortation. "Standing as I do," Lincoln said, "under the folds of the American flag, I ask you to stand by me so long as I stand by it." This simple formula for saving the Union was, in the early months of 1861, a fairly straightforward statement of all that Lincoln believed would be necessary to avoid civil war. Stand by me and all will be well. But all was not well, and he would have more difficulty than he appreciated in recruiting people to stand by him. The secessionist states of the new breakaway Southern Confederacy showed no desire to stand by him. But even among his own Republican Party, there were plenty of voices ready to condemn him for asking too much, as well as for asking too little. When his longtime friend and ally from Illinois politics, Orville Hickman Browning, upbraided him for refusing to support an emancipation decree in Missouri, Lincoln could only reply in dismay, "I confess it astonishes me." No one, however, among Lincoln's Republicans afforded him more such astonishment than the man whom he tapped as his Secretary of the Treasury, which is, of course, Salmon Portland Chase. The conclusion has been, through most accounts of the Lincoln-Chase relationship, and of Lincoln's disagreements with his other friends and allies, like Browning, that Lincoln was right. Automatically right, because, look, he's Abraham Lincoln. And Chase and the others had to be wrong, precisely because, well, they weren't Abraham Lincoln. But that's a conclusion that rests on an a priori assumption, that because Lincoln was right about slavery, right about the extension of slavery into the West, and ultimately right in winning the Civil War for the Union, that he was right about everything and everyone, and that Chase must have been wrong in approximately the same proportion. But that is an assumption, and an assumption which may not bear much weight the closer we inquire into the Lincoln-Chase relationship. Salmon Portland Chase had the misfortune to have disagreed with Abraham Lincoln too many times to make biographers of either man comfortable with him. Frederick Blue's 1987 biography of Chase concludes that his was a career which contemporaries remembered as one motivated by ambition for the presidency. And largely because of that ravenous ambition, Chase made many enemies among public leaders and unfortunately had few lasting friendships. For John Niven, writing about Chase in 1995, Chase ruined his reputation by his promotion of high-minded moral and social goals mixed with his insidious ambition, plus a mixture of condescension and exasperation at Lincoln's finer qualities. The same condemnation of Chase's ambition pervades Doris Kearns Goodwin's popular account of the Lincoln administration. Chase, in Goodwin's account of the team of rivals, is guilty of fierce ambition, unattained ambition, sleepless ambition, and restless ambition for the presidency which was never realized. David Donald, in his great 1995 biography of Lincoln, dismissed Chase as stiff, reserved, and ponderous, and even, given in offhand conversation, to uttering profundities. I'll try to avoid doing that today. For Michael Burlingame, in his landmark 2-volume Lincoln biography, Chase is vain, hyper-ambitious, and haughty. John Hay, Lincoln's secretary, accused Chase of being at work night and day, laying pipe for his own nomination in the place of Lincoln in 1864. And years later, Henry Adams even described the wartime marriage of Chase's daughter, Kate, to Rhode Island's colorless but wealthy governor, William Sprague, as a sacrifice, a burnt offering, Adams put it. which Chase made to secure Sprague's financial backing for a presidential bid. The question, which is not asked as often as it should be, is whether these attributes of Chase were genuine character defects or simply the feature that drives any public person in a democracy. Alexis de Tocqueville found Americans possessed by this universal movement of ambition. In America, he said, equality permits ambition to all. And even at the local level, ambition, that desire for esteem, the need of real interests, the taste for power and attention, is at the center of the ordinary relations of life. Nor was Abraham Lincoln free from ambition. In one of the most illuminating comments he ever made about his old law partner, William Herndon warned admirers of the great emancipator not to discount his intense ambition. Lincoln's ambition, said Herndon, was never satisfied. In him it was a consuming fire. And very nearly the same thing was said about every major political contemporary of Lincoln and Chase, of Charles Sumner, Benjamin Wade, Thaddeus Stevens, William Seward. If Chase was ambitious, it was an illness that he caught from a great many other historically well-regarded people around him. There are two large-scale factors which have to be kept in view in developing any practical understanding of the career and legacy of Salmon Chase and his relationship to Abraham Lincoln, and one of those is Chase's place as an intellectual force in the new Republican movement before the Civil War, and the other is Lincoln's surprising willingness to lean on Chase's advice and counsel for at least the first 2 years of the Lincoln administration. Salmon Chase was born in New Hampshire, just 13 months before the birth of Lincoln, and named for one of his uncles, who, like Lincoln, had been named for an Old Testament patriarch. And no, in case there's anyone who's not aware of it, Chase was not named for a fish. He was named for an Old Testament character, Salmon. After that, however, any near resemblance of the two ceased. Salmon Chase was properly schooled, baptized into the Episcopal Church, and graduated from Dartmouth College in 1826. He began reading law in the Washington office of Attorney General William Wirt, and it was there that he encountered the moral crisis that shaped his life. In August of 1826, a free black deckhand from the United States Navy frigate Macedonian, named Gilbert Horton, was seized in Washington as a runaway slave. Horton was eventually freed. But to get that freedom, the 20-something Chase signed a petition praying for the abolition of slavery and the slave trade in the District of Columbia. From that point, Chase went nowhere but up in the ranks of the new abolition movement. Chase established a law practice in Cincinnati in 1830 and published his first article in the North American Review, praising abolitionists as the friends of freedom, universal freedom, who confine their regards to no peculiar texture or color of the skin. In 1837, he served as counsel to Matilda Lawrence, another accused fugitive. And it was in his defense plea that Chase formulated what would become one of the great anti-slavery arguments of the next 25 years, that slavery can have no existence beyond the territorial limits of the state which sanctions it. So once Matilda Lawrence set foot in Ohio, she ceased to be a slave and could not be considered a fugitive. His argument did not free Lawrence, but it became a staple of abolitionist reasoning, that slavery was merely a local ordinance in the southern states, whereas freedom was the rule everywhere else. Cross into a free state, and freedom became your status. Move your farm and family into the Western Territories, and you found that freedom was the rule there, too. Over the next 5 years, Chase acquired so many fugitive cases that he became known simply as the Attorney General for Fugitives. And in 1842, he was hired to represent John Van Zandt, an Ohio abolitionist who had assisted 9 escapees from slavery in Kentucky. This time, the case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And Chase's plea in Van Zandt's defense made him nationally famous. A slave, Chase declared, is a person held as property by legalized force against natural right. And Chase dared to suggest that even Southern state slavery ordinances were of dubious standing. Force, not law, is what makes men property, for man is not by nature the subject of ownership. The laws of the Creator, which invests every human being with an inalienable title to freedom, cannot be repealed by any inferior law which asserts that man is property. Nevertheless, Chase's appeal for Van Zandt failed, and the failure drove him in 1843 to join the new anti-slavery Liberty Party and then the Free Soil Party. And in 1849, Chase was elected as a Free Soiler to the United States Senate from Ohio. When the Republican Party was organized in 1854, Chase was elected as the first Republican governor of Ohio. And in 1858, he was the only prominent Republican to campaign personally for the Illinois Republican Party's long-shot nominee for the Senate, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's bid failed, but it formed in Lincoln's mind a debt too great to repay. "Allow me to thank you," Lincoln wrote to Chase the following April, "as being one of the very few distinguished men whose sympathy we in Illinois did receive last year, of all those whose sympathy we thought we had reason to expect." Chase was, as Lincoln said to George Boutwell in 1861, about 150 to any other man's 100. This was not to say that Lincoln and Chase were interchangeable, even at that point. In June of 1859, Lincoln was worried about the potential political fallout of the Ohio State Republican Convention's adoption of a call to repeal the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. And he wrote to Chase to warn that the cause of republicanism is hopeless in Illinois if it be in any way made responsible for that plank. And though Lincoln professed to have what he called a kind side for Chase, it did not pay Chase any immediate dividends. Chase was one of the frontrunners for the Republican National Convention's nomination for the presidency in May of 1860, only to find that he slipped into a distant third place at the convention, behind William Seward and behind the ultimate surprise nominee, Abraham Lincoln. But once elected to the presidency, Lincoln called Chase to a conference in January of 1861 to tell him that he was planning to nominate Chase as Secretary of the Treasury. This surprised Chase, who had just been reelected to the Senate in 1860, and who expected that if he would be offered anything, it would be the Secretaryship of State. Even more surprising, Chase was named by the new governor of Ohio as a delegate to the Peace Conference, which met in Washington in February 1861 in a last-ditch effort to avoid civil war. Chase was curiously conciliatory with the slaveholders. "Civil war," he said, "let us not rush headlong into that unfathomable gulf." And rather than demand the repeal of the Fugitive Slave Law, Chase actually suggested compensating the owners of fugitives from the U.S. Treasury. But by the time Lincoln was inaugurated as president on March 4th, 1861, all hope of appeasement had disappeared. The slave states of the South had formed their new Confederate government, and on March 6th, Lincoln sent Chase's name to the Senate as his nominee for Secretary of the Treasury. The two were in harness at last. Or at least they appeared to be. Although Chase's first reaction as a member of Lincoln's cabinet was to allow the South to try the experiment of a separate existence, he soon swerved behind Lincoln at the first meeting of the cabinet. Chase and Postmaster Montgomery Blair were the only members of that cabinet who insisted that the Confederate demand for the surrender of Fort Sumter be resisted, even if war be the result. Once the Confederates attacked Sumter a month later, Chase saw war as the only possible response. The attack on Sumter, he wrote in retrospect, left nothing practicable except the rightful supremacy of the national government over all parts of the Union. And such a war would be the death of slavery. Disunion, he wrote to his sister-in-law in New Orleans, disunion is abolition, and abolition through civil and servile war. For the first 2 years of the war, Chase remained a close ally of Lincoln's and a supporter of Lincoln's policies. When dissension within the cabinet and rumors of corruption left Lincoln no choice in January 1862 but to dismiss Secretary of War Simon Cameron, it was Chase to whom Lincoln turned and deputized as the bearer of the bad news to Cameron. Despite Chase's sympathy with Cameron and Cameron's call for the enlistment of fugitive slaves as Union soldiers. In May of 1862, when Lincoln's impatience with the slow pace of Major General George McClellan's campaign on the James River Peninsula prompted the president to take personal command of a small expedition to land at Norfolk, it was Chase who accompanied him. And when Lincoln decided to marginalize McClellan by creating a new Union army in Virginia, he turned to the anti-slavery Illinoisan John Pope, who happened to be a protege of Chase's. Pope's father-in-law, Valentine Horton, was a close friend of Chase's. Chase did not hesitate to urge Pope to pursue as radical an anti-slavery strategy as he dared at that moment. If I were in the field, Chase assured Pope at the beginning of August 1862, I would let every man understand that no man loyal to the Union can be a slave. We must come to this. Chase's stance on the inevitability of slavery's abolition made him the most radical voice on the subject in Lincoln's cabinet. And as early as November of 1861, Chase was insisting that Lincoln had the constitutional authority to act directly against slavery under the war power, despite the fact that no one then had any clear notion of what, under the Constitution, a presidential war power might be. When Union forces occupied the South Carolina coastal zone around the Port Royal Sound, Chase encouraged the turnover of abandoned plantations to the slaves who had been left behind. And so, as he said, prepare them for self-support by their own industry thereafter. Ultimately, when Lincoln drafted an Emancipation Proclamation later in 1862, the only alteration he accepted was Chase's last-minute recommendation that on an occasion of such interest, the insertion of a solemn recognition of responsibility before men and before God would be appropriate. That recommendation led Lincoln to close the Emancipation Proclamation by describing it as an act of justice and commending it to the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God. Fully as significant for the purpose of defeating the Confederacy was the free hand Lincoln allowed Chase in setting the administration's fiscal policy. Lincoln, as he described himself, was an old-line Henry Clay Whig, and even as a Republican, Lincoln pursued a Whiggish economic agenda that included the great triad of Henry Clay's American system: a national banking network to promote commerce, a program of government-funded infrastructure to assist a market-based national economy, and a system of protective tariffs to foster the development of domestic manufacturing. In that respect, it could be said that Lincoln was the heir of Alexander Hamilton's original plans for a national economy. Chase had been reared in the economics of Hamilton's great adversary, Thomas Jefferson. He was dubious about government involvement in economic affairs, particularly shy of banks and bankers, and indifferent to providing tax support to connect producers and markets. He had, he said, opposed a mere paper money system of currency, had railed against the frauds and undue expansions of banks and their suspensions of payment on their issues and deposits, and had criticized tariffs in favor of free trade. Nevertheless, the demands of the war quickly forced upon Chase a more vigorous economic role for the federal government. The nation had only just emerged from a major economic depression when the crisis over secession erupted in December of 1860. And at once, interest rates on short-term Treasury notes soared to 12%, and the usual 6% bonds could only be sold at rates up to 11%. After only 6 months in office, Chase could see the war costing at least $350 million before the end of the fiscal year in mid-1862. And by January of 1862, Chase had to admit to Lincoln that he has no money and can raise no more. The bottom is out of the tub. By 1864, Chase estimated that the expenses of the government were reaching $66 million a month. That's $66,1864. And so Chase shelved his personal hesitations, and it was under Chase's secretariat that Congress approved the creation of a national banking system through the National Banking Act of 1863, which drew the existing collection of northern banking houses into a coherent network. He also backed the imposition of the highest tariff rates in American history, levied the first rudimentary income tax, and issued the first legal tender paper currency, the so-called greenbacks. The greenbacks were especially galling to Chase. It is true that I came with reluctance to the conclusion that the legal tender greenbacks were a necessity, he admitted. But I came to it decidedly, and I support it earnestly. Chase's most dramatic turn in economic policy centered on the lengths he was forced to go in inventing a borrowing strategy for the Lincoln administration. Chase had only been in office for 5 months when he held a summit meeting with New York City's bankers, and he learned from them, politely but firmly, that they would only extend themselves to loaning the government $100 million, and alleged their inability to take more bonds than their disposable capital allowed without a prospect of an early sale and distribution. But Chase soon discovered an alternative in the form of a fellow Ohioan, Jay Cooke, and Cooke's proposal to issue a perfect storm of ingenious new bonds and notes to be sold directly to the public. Chase made Cooke his general subscription agent for selling Treasury securities, like the ingenious 520 bonds. These were discounted bonds, which were sold in denominations as low as $50 and which were redeemable at a minimum of 5 years or 20 years to full maturity. Together, Cooke and Chase were able to persuade the public, and not just the bankers, to invest their money and their self-interest in Union and Lincoln's victory. And yet the common purpose which had united Lincoln and Chase began to loosen by the end of 1862. Part of that loosening was Chase's mounting impatience with Lincoln's zigzag approach to emancipation. In April of 1862, Major General David Hunter, the military commandant at Port Royal, had unilaterally issued an emancipation edict throughout the Union-occupied South Carolina coastal zone. Irritated at Hunter, Lincoln revoked the order. Chase, however, strenuously disagreed. Nothing Lincoln had done had so sorely tried him as the nullifying of Hunter's proclamation. But Lincoln was adamant. "No commanding general shall do such a thing upon my responsibility without consulting me," he told Chase, and that was that. Chase grew more unhappy in August of 1862, when Lincoln held a meeting at the White House with black leaders where he urged them to agree to a program for colonization of freed slaves abroad. Chase was aghast. "How much better," he wrote, "would be a manly protest against prejudice against color and a wise effort to give free men homes in America." In May of 1863, Lincoln endorsed the arrest of former Ohio Congressman Clement Vallandigham for an incendiary anti-war speech Vallandigham had delivered at Mount Vernon, Ohio. And then, following on that, a subsequent trial, not by a civil court, but by a military tribunal. Chase had no love for Vallandigham, but if Vallandigham violated any law, he should have been arrested, tried, and convicted in a civil court. "I have never myself been much afraid of words," he said, "even from anti-war Democrats like Vallandigham. The best response," Chase thought, "would have been to reply by augmented efforts in the service of the country rather than by arrest and imprisonment." Nor did it help that Chase found Lincoln's management style grating. "We who are called members of the cabinet," Chase complained to Ohio Senator John Sherman, "are in reality only separate heads of departments, meeting now and then for talk on whatever happens to come uppermost, not for grave consultation on matters concerning the salvation of the country." Above all, Chase was upset by Lincoln's deferring increasingly to the influence of the man who had won the job Chase coveted, and that was Secretary of State William Seward. The elegant and raffish Seward appealed more to Lincoln's sensibilities than the serious and unsmiling idealism of his Treasury Secretary, and especially as Seward endorsed Lincoln's cautious prudence in dealing with slavery. Chase, unwisely, began whispering to Republican members of Congress that Seward was the unseen hand behind Lincoln's hesitations, a mesmerist who was using Lincoln as a puppet. In December 1862, a senatorial committee demanded a meeting with Lincoln, hoping to confront him with Chase's backstage accusations. Lincoln instead turned the tables on Chase by inviting the entire cabinet to the meeting and encouraging them to tell the senators that nothing had ever occurred there which would suppress a reasonable discussion of all issues. Chase left the meeting deeply embarrassed and offered his resignation. But Seward had likewise offered his resignation, and that allowed Lincoln to refuse them both. From that point, the Lincoln-Chase relationship ebbed. Lincoln ceased to call upon Chase for independent tasks. Chase, even more unwisely, allowed Kansas Senator Samuel Pomeroy to circulate a pamphlet in February 1864, calling on the Republican National Committee to dump Lincoln from the upcoming presidential ticket and replace him with Chase. The Pomeroy circular only embarrassed Chase still more deeply, and it allowed Lincoln to set Chase down as an ambitious meddler. Chase's head, Lincoln sarcastically remarked, was so full of presidential maggots he would never be able to get them out. Finally, in June 1864, they quarreled over a patronage appointment. And when Chase issued another resignation letter, Lincoln accepted it. "You and I have reached a point of mutual embarrassment in our official relations," Lincoln replied, "which it seems to me cannot be overcome." By that point, Chase had reconciled himself to his dismissal. "I may have been too earnest and eager," he admitted, "while I thought him not earnest enough and too slow." But fundamentally, the two men had simply lost meaningful connection with each other. "I feel that I do not know him," Chase sighed. And yet, the personal and temperamental chilliness Lincoln and Chase felt did not subtract from the conviction that both Lincoln and Chase shared about slavery. Little more than 6 months after accepting Chase's resignation, Lincoln nominated him to replace the infamous Roger Taney as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, confident that Chase would ensure that a Chase court would not overturn the Emancipation Proclamation or any of the other measures Lincoln had brought forward to destroy slavery. On the issues which mattered most to both, Chase had stood and would continue to stand with Lincoln. In the first great decision which Chase wrote for the court, in Texas versus White in 1866, Chase made it abundantly clear that secession was an unconstitutional illusion. For him, secession meant that the states which composed the American Republic had entered into an indissoluble relation, and it was final. There was no place for reconsideration or revocation except through revolution. Lincoln, had he still been alive, could hardly have said it better. It was the misfortune of Salmon Portland Chase to stand, like so many others in the Civil War years, in the considerable shadow of Abraham Lincoln. And so, an even greater misfortune overtook Chase when he allowed differences of strategy to weaken the common vision of a free nation, free of slavery, that animated them both. Still, after Chase's death in 1873, even fellow justices like Samuel Miller, who found Chase warped by his aspirations for presidential grandeur, had to concede that Chase was a great man and a better man than public life generally leaves one after 40 years. It is important for us to understand how much Lincoln's success depended on Chase's performance in the vital role of the administration's moneymaker, and how much Chase's unceasing calls for a new racial order in American life provided a radical baseline from which Lincoln could operate safely. Without Lincoln, it is safe to say, the Republic could not have survived the Civil War. Without Salmon Chase to stand with him, we might have to remember Abraham Lincoln in a far less exalted light. Thank you very much. Now, it is my understanding that the floor will be open for questions. And I believe we have, well.
Yeah, we have about 15 minutes for questions. Anyone? Okay, Vlad in the back. Heather.
Great, thank you. Very interesting presentation. So in the modern period, I guess we've talked a lot about Chase in the context of his decision in the Griffin case that many view today as kind of gutting the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. I'm just curious if you have any context for that part of his reputation.
Well, Chase has no dissent to offer from the 14th Amendment or its components. What is interesting, though, is that the 14th Amendment undergoes a challenge of sorts in slaughterhouse cases in 1873. And you might say that from that point, that is where the Reconstruction jurisprudence of the Supreme Court spirals downwards and on its downwards path collects things like civil rights cases in 1883, and then ultimately, of course, Plessy versus Ferguson in the 1890s. By the time Slaughterhouse Cases comes to the Chase court, Chase himself has suffered a major stroke. He's very ill. He does not play an active part in dealing with slaughterhouse cases. That is largely going to belong to Joseph Bradley. And Chase dies in 1873. So it is difficult to pin exactly where Chase would have located himself in dealing with Slaughterhouse and dealing with the 14th Amendment further on down. Nevertheless, it is true that Chase makes no specific effort to critique or to oppose the 14th Amendment. Did his influence, was that shared by Bradley? Did it color the conclusions that were drawn by the court in slaughterhouse cases? That is more a matter of conjecture. What is interesting is that Chase, while Chase will be responsible for a number of important court decisions, he's also responsible for a number of qualifications. And it seems to me that the most enduring one of them concerns Ex parte Milligan. Ex parte Milligan, just to fill in a little blank space here, Ex parte Milligan was about a character named Lambden P. Milligan, who was arrested on the grounds that he was participating in a plot during the war to provoke an insurrection in Indiana. And he's put on trial by a military tribunal. He's condemned to death, and then Lincoln is assassinated. Milligan had hoped that he was going to get a pardon from Lincoln. Well, when Lincoln is assassinated, immediately the hope of pardon disappears. So Milligan wants to go to court and try to see if there's a civil alternative to what the military tribunal has done. Case goes up to the Supreme Court. The decision is written by David Davis, who is, as a matter of fact, on this slide right here. David Davis writes a very trenchant opinion in Ex parte Milligan, in which he says, the Constitution is the law of the land in times of war as much as in times of peace. Military tribunals have no role to play. This was a decision that's no surprise because Davis had in fact been haranguing Lincoln about this while Lincoln was still alive. Chase, however, writes a consenting opinion, but he introduces one qualification. Military tribunals can be authorized if they're authorized by Congress. That lay dormant for a long time, and it awakened with a vengeance during the War on Terror, because the non-combatants, the enemy combatants who are imprisoned at Guantanamo, are wanting to apply for a writ of habeas corpus. They do not want to be tried by a military tribunal. So what is the status of the military tribunals at Guantanamo? This is where Chase's exception comes back to haunt everybody, because that's what leads Congress to pass the AUMF, the Authorization for the Use of Military Force. Because as Chase had written, if Congress authorizes military tribunals, then they can proceed. So you might say that Salmon Chase continues to have an active hand in some of our jurisprudence even today. Would that have also, is that also something we can trace in slaughterhouse cases? It would have helped if he had lived long enough for that and been in sufficiently good health to have participated actively in that decision. Instead, what we're really hearing is the voice of Joseph Bradley.
Anyone else? I have a question. Obviously, the relationship between Lincoln and Chase as president and cabinet secretary tells us something, at least, about Lincoln's approach to presidential power. So he's a Whig. The Whigs are generally known for decentralizing power, kind of letting the cabinet secretaries do what they want. It's a little interesting. You have this quote from Chase where he's like, all I do is run my department. A lot of people would say, I get to run my department without the president telling me what to do.
Well, it was the biggest department in the federal government at that point. There were more employees. Chase supervised more employees than William Henry Seward, more employees, in fact, than Edwin McMaster Stanton, not counting the Army, of course, but more employees than Stanton in the War Department, because every official who had something to do with collecting revenue of various sorts was part of the Treasury Department and reported to Chase, which is why Chase's building, the Treasury building, was larger than the White House, and his office was larger than Lincoln's. Well, you know, that speaks to the importance of the Secretary of the Treasury in the 19th century. But I interrupted a question you were asking. Isn't that terrible of me? I interrupt with an answer for a question he hadn't asked. All right.
So, but did Chase think that he had the right to run his department without
He
presidential control? What does this tell you about the power, the take care power?
Well, he
under
certainly
Article 2, Section
did,
3?
because what you have to see is that from the creation of the first executive cabinet under Washington, there had been a bracket creep, shall we say, in terms of the authority and the autonomy of the cabinet. And through the 19th century, presidential cabinets acquire more and more in the way of their own discretionary power. Probably the apex of this, as an example, is Jefferson Davis as Secretary of War under Franklin Pierce, where Davis basically makes decisions without even bothering to consult Franklin Pierce. Not that Franklin Pierce was the sort of person you went out of your way to consult. I've never yet met a member of the Franklin Pierce Society. I don't know that there is one, but anyway. That steady movement upwards in terms of the autonomy of the presidential cabinet, to the point where it begins to look like it's moving in the direction of a British parliamentary style cabinet. All of that comes to a complete halt with Lincoln. Lincoln makes it clear from the get-go. Heads of these various departments are reportable to him. They carry out his wishes, they do his will. That's it. That completely redirects the purpose of the presidential cabinet, and in fact, in large measure, the presidential cabinet as we understand it today, which is a much bigger affair, still operates on that same principle. Members of the cabinet do not have autonomy, they do not have discretion, they have to do what the president says. Lincoln is the one who sets that pattern, and it reverses a pattern which had been escalating in the other direction through the 19th century.
One last question. Galata's always telling me who to call on, so I'm here.
Does the lack of talk about people like Chase in most history classes, at least in my history classes, there isn't a lot of talk about people like Salmon P. Chase, especially in regards to his relationship with Abraham Lincoln, which seemed crucial to Abraham Lincoln's pro-abolitionist motives. Does that highlight a problem that we have in our general education system around history, where we tend to focus more on these major historical figures like Abraham Lincoln, like Martin Luther King, or whoever you could think of, and not the people that would have otherwise played crucial roles in influencing the changes that you saw from those leaders?
Sometimes influencing is the smallest part of it. In Chase's case, you might say what Chase does is provide cover. Because Lincoln can always turn around to people who are criticizing his movement on emancipation as being too much, too far. He can always say, well, look, I've got to satisfy Chase. And that can always become a very interesting way of explaining things. For other members of the cabinet who disagree, he can always suggest that they and Chase have a discussion, of which, of course, he will be the arbiter. And in that respect, there's many ways in which Lincoln is able to use the influence of Chase to his own purposes. Now, when we talk about Lincoln using influence with people, sometimes that can sound a bit demeaning, because we're supposed to have Lincoln in that great chair in the Lincoln Memorial, and we're supposed to regard him as a demigod. Well, there's a great deal about Lincoln that is remarkable beyond description. But let's also remember he was a very practical politician. He was a politician to his fingertips. He loved politics. Herndon said about Lincoln that politics were his heaven and newspapers were his food. So he loved politics. He understood what to do with politics. He understood how to get people to move from point A to point B. Sometimes it could be by very direct means, sometimes it could be by very indirect. Chase is part of that overall strategy that he exercises. Because just because Lincoln's got a cabinet doesn't mean that he's going to get agreement and cooperation from them at every point. He doesn't. He has some very conservative people like Montgomery Blair, who's his postmaster general, and Blair is very resistant to almost all of the emancipation moves that Lincoln wants to make. And Blair's to be reckoned with because his father is Francis Preston Blair Sr., And old F.P. Blair is one of the great political movers and shakers in Washington. You didn't trifle with the Blairs. It was often said that when the Blairs went in for a fight, they went in for a funeral. And that was not something that you took lightly. So you have Montgomery Blair on the one hand. You have his Attorney General, Edward Bates, who's also very dubious about some of the emancipation initiatives. Lincoln needs someone who is going to balance off against them in the cabinet if he's going to make any kind of reasonable movement on the subject of emancipation. And this is what Chase provides for him on the other side. Chase along with Edwin M. Stanton. So those two become the radical voices in the cabinet, and Chase the most consistent of them. I mean, Stanton comes to his emancipation views largely because he is the Secretary of War and he wants to please Lincoln. He's an opportunist that way. Chase is an idealist. The word Chase uses about himself over and over and over and over again in his correspondence is earnest. He is an earnest man. And that idealism was very convenient to Lincoln in dealing with a cabinet that was not always hugely cooperative within itself. So yes, Lincoln knows how to use that. And Chase is an important part of the formula, of the algorithm that moves the United States not only toward the restoration of the Union, but to a Union now freed from the taint of slavery. Chase plays a major role in that, no question.
Well, thanks again to Professor Guelzo. Thank you all for coming.